Good afternoon, Prime Minister. My name is Ewa Krajewska, and I'm Councillor for the Canadian Civil Liberties Association. Prime Minister, I wanted to start off with the quick chronology leading up to the invocation of the Emergencies Act. On February 13th, you meet with the IRG around 4 p.m., correct?
Yes.
And then you meet with Cabinet the evening of the 13th, correct?
Yes.
And at that time, Cabinet delegates to you the ultimate decision to invoke the Emergencies Act, and Clerk Charette characterized this as left it at referendum to the Prime Minister, correct?
Yes.
And you consult with your caucus the morning of the 14th, correct?
Yes.
And then with the First Ministers the morning of...
Sorry, it was more of an informing caucus than consulting with them, but yes.
Okay, that's fine. And then you consult with the First Ministers also the morning of the 14th.
Yes.
You speak to Mr. Jagmeet Singh and the Leader of the Opposition, Ms. Bergen, that same day. And you announce the invocation of the EA at a 4:30 press conference that afternoon, correct?
Yes.
Correct. And so the Emergencies Act is invoked on February 14th, and then the measures that are put in place under the Emergencies Act are enacted on February 15th, correct?
Yes.
And those, if I can put them as two buckets, the two buckets of measures that are invoked on the 15th, the first are there is now a prohibition on public assembly that may lead to a breach of the peace, correct? Mm-hmm. And the second are various economic measures that include the freezing of accounts of anyone who is involved in that public assembly that may lead to a breach of the peace, correct?
Yes.
Right. And now going back a little bit, you spoke briefly about Windsor. The blockade at the Ambassador Bridge, that was a significant event. That was one of the events that led to the invocation of the Emergencies Act, correct?
It was one of many, but yes.
It was one of many. And you understand that the police, both the Windsor Police Service and the OPP, started to clear that block starting on February 12th?
Yes.
And that continued on February 13th?
Yes.
And I believe WPS, Windsor Police Service, tweeted that the Windsor Ambassador Bridge was cleared at 1200 on February 14th.
That sounds right.
Now, with respect to Coutts, that was another blockade of a border that was causing you and the government a significant concern, correct?
Yes.
And you were informed by Premier Kenney on February 14th in the morning that the RCMP had started to make arrests the night before, correct?
Yes.
And that, in his words, the situation has been secured and they will now proceed with broader arrests and secure the border. You remember that?
Yes.
Okay. And in Alberta is one of the provinces that had in place or has in place a critical infrastructure legislation that protects critical infrastructure from blockades, including highways, correct?
Yes.
Now, the Ottawa demonstrations and the blockade, they don't get removed until later in the week of February 15th, correct?
Correct.
And for the purpose of that operation, the RCMP, the OPP, and the OPS, they form a joint command.
Yes.
And Prime Minister, you agree that the Emergencies Act and the orders enacted under the Emergencies Act, there was nothing in those orders that created the joint command.
No.
Right.
Sorry. Yes, I agree that the Emergencies Act did not address creation of joint commands, although it did allow for the easy deputization of RCMP officers to enforce municipal bylaws and municipal rules without having to go through the usual processes that are required if they want to do that, which allowed for a greater integration.
Correct. It did away with the administrative process that was taking some time of having the RCMP enforce local bylaws.
So it did facilitate the coming together of those three forces.
But the joint command in and of itself, that was something that the police could have created and could have done without the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Yes.
Right. And we heard evidence from Commissioner Lucky of the RCMP that she had signed off on a plan to enforce and remove the protesters in Ottawa on February 13th, that she had confidence in, that she, the OPP, and the OPS had confidence in. Did you hear that testimony?
No, I disagree with that.
Okay, you disagree with that?
Yes, I do not believe that the plan that was either signed off on supposedly by the RCMP or presented by the Ottawa Police Services on the 13th was in any real regards an actual plan for clearing the protests.
And is this a plan that you saw, or that you were just spoken to about?
I was spoken to about. I did not see it myself.
Okay, and were you spoken to about it by Commissioner Lucky or by Minister Mendocino?
I don't remember.
You don't remember. But as at February 13th, your impression was that the plan that was in place at that time was not one that you or the RCMP had confidence in?
It was not one that we had confidence in, no.
Okay. All right. I will leave it there because I think there are other parties here that understand that better than I do. Okay. So in terms of the legal tools that were available in Ottawa, we heard evidence from Superintendent Bernier, who was the event commander for the Ottawa Police Services. You're familiar with that?
Yes.
Okay. He testified that he did not communicate to anyone that he needed, or the OPS needed, additional tools in order to implement their plan. Did you hear that evidence?
In hindsight, yes, during this process.
During this process. But at the time, you did not hear from OPS or Superintendent Bernier that the OPS required additional legal tools or legal resources.
What we saw consistently was the occupation was continuing, and the ability of the police to resolve it was not there.
Right, and you spoke about that earlier with Ms. Chowdhury, that both you, the government, and I think both Clerk Charette and Deputy Clerk Drouin all expressed the view that or even frustration that the police had not been using the legal tools available to them to remove the demonstrators.
Or had not been able to use.
Or had not been able to use those tools.
Legal tools, yes.
Okay. And Prime Minister Brenda Lucki, the commissioner of the RCMP, also on the 13th, she was of the view that existing legal tools had not been exhausted, and she communicated this to the Chief of Staff to Minister Mendocino. Were you aware of that? I
was not aware of that at the time. As we went around the virtual table at the IRG that day, the consensus from everyone, including the Commissioner of the RCMP, was clear that we were advancing on these extra tools. And as I said, I don't disagree with that assessment that not all tools had been used. That was part of the problem, that not all tools were being used to end this occupation.
Right. And Prime Minister, we talked about the threshold for invoking a national emergency. You spoke about that briefly in your examination in chief. And you understand that other than the threshold in the CSIS Act, part of the test is whether the matter exceeds both the capacity and the authority of a province to deal with the matter. You understand that?
Yes.
And Deputy Clerk Drouin said that authority refers to legal authority and capacity refers to operational capacity. And you would agree with that?
Okay, yes.
And when I'm taking you back now to your press conference at 4:30 on the 14th. At that press conference, you specifically referred to the fact that there were serious challenges to law enforcement's ability to effectively enforce the law. You remember that?
Yes.
And that the Emergencies Act will be used to strengthen and support law enforcement agencies at all levels of the country. You remember saying that?
Yes.
And that the police will be given more tools to restore order in places where public assemblies can constitute illegal and dangerous activities.
Yes.
And so at that time, that was one of the main justifications that you stated publicly for the invocation of the Emergencies Act.
Yes.
And that was, again, because many of your ministers and many of the people in the public service had expressed frustration with the police inability to exercise those legal tools.
No, it wasn't just because people had expressed frustration. It was real concern. As you mentioned, that a number of places were moving in the right direction in terms of resolving the situation at Coutts, resolving the situation at the Ambassador Bridge. There was a very real and present concern that it is one thing to clear a lane or two, it is another thing to keep a border location or otherwise open. And what we had seen was intentions for the convoy to pop up again at the Blue Water Bridge in Sarnia, at Fort Erie. There was discussion of Lacol. There were more activities starting in Surrey and BC at other border crossings. There was a ongoing concern that it wasn't just about ending the places that were there. It was ensuring that they simply didn't shift to another locale, because many of these convoy participants had come a long way across the country and were mobile enough to go to another nearby location.
And so you were in a sense making sure it was almost preventative in terms of we remove them and we want to prevent them from relocating and restaging at another location. Would that be fair?
Yes, that was a concern, but at the same time, there was very much a concern that it be temporary that we brought in, that we not keep the Emergencies Act in place for a minute longer than necessary. And when the RCMP suggested that they wanted it in place for 3 weeks, or they would need it in place for up to 3 weeks, we took that very seriously as a request, but we ended up saying, no, we're going to end it as quickly as we can, and we did.
And Prime Minister, you spoke about how you were advised that it would be impermissible for the government to direct the police. And that was a line that you and your staff and your ministers understood very clearly, correct?
Yes, we were very careful about that.
You're very careful about that.
Yes.
But you'd agree that when you invoke the Emergencies Act and you very publicly say to the police, these are tools that you now have, that you are publicly signaling, this is the road we want you to walk down now and use these tools in order to deal with these demonstrators. Do you agree with that?
We were very clearly saying that we need to restore enforcement of the law and we need to restore public order. But as I said clearly a little earlier, in the situation of a theoretical blockade at Lacol, I was very clear with the Premier of Quebec and indeed in communications that if the public order emergency tools weren't necessary, they didn't need to use them.
And Quebec did not invoke their own Emergencies Act, correct? They did not.
I'm not sure, but I'll take your word for it.
Well, I don't think Quebec invoked their Emergencies Act for the purpose of the thing, for the convoy. Now, my last area of question, Prime Minister, is with respect to the CSIS Act and its integration into the Emergencies Act. So you've stated under the CSIS Act, when CSIS determines that they are going to use surveillance on a person, they need to meet the threshold at Section 2, correct?
Yes.
And that's because the surveillance of one person without other legal authority is something that is very serious and that requires a high legal threshold, correct? Now, I understand your evidence that for the purpose of the Emergencies Act, we are dealing with a different context, yes?
Yes.
A different purpose?
Yes.
And we're dealing with a different decision maker, correct? But I would put to you that when invoking the Emergencies Act, that threshold, the level of threshold of the security threat that must be met cannot be any lower than it is when CSIS is proposing to surveil one person, that the threshold is no different. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do.
Thank you, Prime Minister. Those are my questions.